Hello and welcome to another episode of Scream Theory. So one of the more difficult aspects of false chord screaming is figuring out how to get those super low-pitched, brutal, death growl, guttural sounding lows. Now, with regular false chord screaming, we can generally leave our false chords mostly relaxed, and we can push air and cause them to move and vibrate and flap around, and that produces different noises. We can contract the muscles in our larynx to alter the positioning of the false chords to some degree and create different tones, but for the most part, they generally stay pretty relaxed. Now, with the super brutal guttural lows, there actually are a few more muscles contracting. And before I get into any of that, I want to show you some examples of what I'm talking about. The first example, I'm going to do what I would call like a standard low-pitched false chord scream, and then the second example is the more super brutal low-pitched guttural noise. Oh, oh, So now you kind of hear the difference between the two sounds I'm talking about, but I want to play those clips again, and I want you to listen closely and try to infer the positioning of my larynx and my false chords, just the general positioning of my vocal structures when I produce those sounds. Oh, oh, So the regular low-pitched false chord scream sounded kind of more open and hollow, and you could really tell that my false chords were pretty relaxed, whereas the super brutal guttural noise sounded like more tight and constricted. It kind of sounded like I was physically jamming something in my throat together. Hopefully that's what you were able to imagine when hearing those two sounds, but just being able to listen to the noises a person is making and try to just imagine the general positioning of the structures in their throat and how they're doing the technique is like really good for figuring out what other people are doing. Being able to listen to somebody and make those general inferences about how they're placing their vocal structures will go a long way when you're trying to analyze someone's technique and figure out how to make different sounds. But back to the low-pitched guttural noise. So yes, we do have to involve some laryngeal muscles that we wouldn't normally use when we're speaking or when we're singing, or at least not all the time, and not to the degree that we need to use them when producing those sounds. And the muscles I'm talking about is the transverse arytenoid muscle and the oblique arytenoid muscles. So these muscles play an important role in further adducting or bringing our vocal cords together, as well as our false cords together, and the arytenoid cartilage together. So now I'm going to break down the anatomy and the biomechanics of it just so you can start to visually understand what you're trying to make the muscles in your throat do. But if you don't care for any of that, if you're not here for that, then just go ahead and skip to this point in the video. So here are some anatomy pictures from KenHub, and KenHub is a great website for learning anatomy, but these pictures in particular, if I could meet the artist that drew these, I would give them a hug, because these are so good for illustrating the actions of the muscle groups I want to talk about and showing the movements of the arytenoid cartilage. So just for a quick frame of reference, we're looking at a top-down view of the vocal cords. This is the thyroid cartilage, which would be in the front of the larynx. These two conoid, triangular-shaped nodule things, these are the arytenoid cartilages. And here we see the vocal cords, which connect from the thyroid cartilage to each individual arytenoid cartilage. We can see the thyroarytenoid muscle spans from the thyroid cartilage to the arytenoid cartilage, hence the name thyroarytenoid. This more medial band of fibers is the vocalis muscle, and then the more medial section, this ligamentous portion, is the vocalis ligament. Now, unfortunately, these pictures do not show the false chords, but they share the same attachment points as the vocal cords. They're just located 3 to 5 millimeters above the vocal cords. So if they were there, we would see them kind of like this, just connected from the thyroid cartilage to the arytenoid cartilage, located a little bit above the vocal cords. It's just another layer. So I just want you to pretend that the false chords are there, but what I really want to focus on is the movement of the arytenoid cartilage. So I've zoomed in, and I know it's a little bit blurry, but I want to focus on these muscle fibers. So this section of fibers that spans horizontally, connecting each arytenoid cartilage, is the transverse arytenoid muscle. And then we have the two oblique arytenoid muscles. It's a pair of muscles, and they span in the same direction but more at a diagonal angle, hence the name oblique. Now, when these muscles contract, they bring the arytenoid cartilage closer together, as you can see in this picture. So here we see the contraction of these muscle groups, and the arytenoid cartilage adducts, comes closer together. So now I have the images side by side. Maybe you can see it a little bit better, but this image on the left, this is the positioning of the vocal cords whenever we're just speaking, and also when we're singing, but only during certain singing techniques. And this image on the right, this is the position that we want to be in. We want a good contraction of these muscles in order to bring the arytenoid cartilage closer together. And just think about how this positioning would be able to contribute to that sound. The arytenoid cartilages are dense masses of cartilage. So if we were pushing air through the vocal structures to make them vibrate, well, the arytenoid cartilage, some of that airflow would also go between the arytenoid cartilages. And because they're very dense, massy structures, they're going to rumble a little bit. So now we have the dense arytenoid cartilages rumbling and the posterior portion of the false chords also being further jammed together towards the midline or adducted. And overall, this creates more vibrating mass. And this is why those low-pitched gurgly guttural noises sound a lot more tighter and more constricted, like something is actually being jammed together. Well, that thing that's being jammed together is the arytenoid cartilage and the posterior portions of the false chords. And you can definitely visualize these actions occurring as I produce the low-pitched guttural sounds. You can hear how these actions are contributing to that sound. So the question is, how do we improve motor control and increase force generation of the transverse arytenoid muscle and the oblique arytenoid muscle? Well, I started to think. A lot of people have an issue with activating these muscles while using their false chords. So before even getting to that point, how do we use them in normal phonation? How do we use them with our true chords? Because that's probably a lot easier than just trying to use them with your false chords right off bat. Well, if you're familiar with the Melissa Cross Zen of Screaming warm-up exercises, there's one exercise that I don't know if she thought of it for this purpose, but if she did, then hats off to her, she's a genius. But it's the E exercise, the one where you make the very tight-sounding E noise. So when we do that very tight E, we are actually contracting those two muscles. So the way this exercise works is you start by trying to just make an open E sound. So you're like, and then you try to transition into a very tight sounding E, like where you're really exaggerating the E pronunciation. So you go, and as you transition from the open E into the tight-sounding E, you should feel something tense up in the back of your larynx. And there it is. It's those two muscles we were talking about. So now we have a phonetic sound that we can perform to start using these two muscles. Okay, well, what's the best way to go about doing this exercise to improve motor control of these muscles? Well, in order to improve motor control and enhance motor learning for any voluntary muscle in our body, what we want is a high amount of reps, as many reps as possible, and each rep done with good form. So an exercise for improving motor control should not cause someone to get fatigued or get tired, because then the quality of each repetition goes down, and now we're just drilling in bad technique. But we also want the exercise to be somewhat challenging, just challenging enough to where they really have to think about how they're doing it, and it's not just boring and they're just turning their brain off and going through the motions. So here are a few different ways we can do this exercise to get the most benefit of learning to use these muscles. First, we're going to go from the open E and we're going to transition into the tight sounding E and make the transition as slow as possible and really focus on the transition, the quality of the transition as you gradually turn these muscles on and gradually transition from the open E to the tight E. That is really what you want to focus on, using these muscles and getting a quality contraction throughout the entire range that they shorten. And so notice how I was focusing on the gradual shortening, and once I got to that end point, then I relaxed them and they just opened again. And then the next exercise is the exact opposite of that. We're going to very quickly go from the open E to the tight E, and then gradually relax the muscle as we focus on the transition from the tight E to the open E. So do this exercise as much as you possibly can, and in the first few weeks you may even notice substantial gains in your ability to control that action. When we go to the gym and we lift weights and we're a complete beginner with lifting weights and someone starts and they're only able to do like 50 pounds bench press, and then like a week later they're up to doing a 60-pound bench press, and a week later they're doing 70 pounds, and it's like, oh, I can lift 20 more pounds in just 2 weeks of exercise. Well, no. We didn't really make strength gains, we made neurological control gains. We've essentially learned how to activate more motor units of that muscle, get better activation of that muscle. So it's not really strength gains we're making at this point. In order to produce the force generating capacity of these two muscles that we're talking about, that's going to come with time, with regular use. It's not like we can put some dumbbells in our throat and crank out some bicep curls with our transverse arytenoid muscle. That's not going to happen, but just through regularly using the muscle and really focusing on getting that E as tight as possible over time, that muscle will become stronger. But this first few weeks of doing this exercise, you may notice substantial gains just from that improved motor control. And hopefully, with that improved motor control, we'll now have a crossover effect into activating those muscles when we use our false chords. However, the position that we put our false chords in when doing those super brutal guttural noises is very different than that E exercise. We want to imagine we're kind of bringing the entire larynx down, dropping it in our throat, and what helps with that is imagining we're trying to push our tongue both downward and then making it flush with like the anterior portion of our neck. So imagine if you put your fingers here, like right above your Adam's apple between your chin and your thyroid cartilage. And imagine you were trying to push the bottom of your tongue into your fingers. And also try to feel that tongue contraction as far down into your throat as possible. Combining that with activating the transverse arytenoid and oblique arytenoid muscles, well, then we've got a chance to produce even lower lows. So even with the right activation of all these muscles, it's still going to take many months of practice. So just keep practicing. And the thing you want to have on your mind is just imagine you're trying to bring it all down. Not just the sounds you're producing by making lower and lower lows. You just want to imagine you're trying to bring the whole larynx down as well. And it's almost like, kind of feels like your false chords and your arytenoid cartilage are like closing over your larynx as you bring it all down, and that they're kind of getting jammed together. It's gonna come gradually over the course of months, but just really just keep pushing in that direction. What really helps me learn things is trying to take a very complex idea and associating it with just a more simple concept. So one thing I like to imagine is like I'm a frog or a toad or one of those frogs that expands their necks when they go ribbit or when they croak, and that expansion of the neck is just kind of how I imagine me pushing my tongue both anteriorly into my neck and also downward.
Ribbit, ribbit.
Or sometimes I think about it as like Arnold Schwarzenegger when he makes all those weird grunting noises from his old movies.
I am Arnold Schwarzenegger. Get to the chopper. Blood.
I know it's silly, but, I'm betting there's gonna be people watching this video and then they'll hear that and they'll be like, ah, that just made it click for me. And another thing I want to mention is that when I do the super gurgly sound, like when I really emphasize that gurgly, throaty sound, like that type of sound, I kind of feel a lot of the vibrations like in the front of my throat, like right above my Adam's apple, kind of all like right in here. And even though the action is occurring in the back of our throat, maybe that's just kind of where all the force transmits. Maybe that's just the sensation I feel. I don't know. But if you're feeling that and it doesn't hurt and you're producing a more gurgly sound, then you're on the right track. So, in the first few weeks to a month that we start doing these exercises, you may notice dramatic increases in your ability to control these muscles. If we start to use a muscle that we never really used before, well, our body is learning how to recruit more muscle fibers and more motor units. And in those first few weeks that you regularly use that muscle, you should notice drastic improvements in your ability to control that muscle. And as those muscles get stronger, we'll be able to contract them harder, and that is part of the gradual progression into getting those deeper and deeper lows, because if we can contract those muscles harder, we can further jam the false chords and the arytenoid cartilage together, we can create more adductive force, and it'll make our scream sound better. So that's pretty much it for this video. Just got to keep practicing, do these exercises, really focus on that tension in the back of your larynx as you do the exercises, and just try to start involving these muscles more into your low-pitched false chord screams. If you like this video, and if you like the way I teach metal vocals, well, please comment, give a thumbs up, and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.